In the spring of 1817, when England wore its gentlest face and the hedgerows breathed green promise, Guinevere stood in a borrowed cloak outside a narrow townhouse in Bath and learned, with a single courteous sentence, that she was no longer welcome. The lady of the house spoke kindly, even regretfully, yet her eyes drifted toward the door as though Guinevere's presence threatened the very air. It was said afterward that the girl had lingered too long, that youth without fortune invited misunderstanding, and that beauty was a liability when unguarded by a father's name. Guinevere did not argue. She had been raised to silence rather than protest, to endure rather than accuse. At 22, she possessed the education of a gentlewoman, the hands of one unaccustomed to labor, and the newly learned discipline of hunger. Her father's death had taken more than affection. It had stripped her of certainty, leaving debts that polite society pretended not to see while ensuring she felt them everywhere. She gathered her few belongings, bowed with composure, and stepped back into the street as though dismissal were an expected appointment. By the time Ashcombe was mentioned, it arrived not as hope but as necessity. A distant connection, strained thin by circumstance, had whispered of a duke newly installed and temporarily inconvenienced by renovations. He required no companion, no ornament, only a cook for 1 week. It was work beneath her upbringing and yet perilously above refusal. Guinevere accepted the address with gratitude sharpened by shame, and traveled through budding countryside toward an estate whose name alone carried centuries of command. Ashcombe Hall rose from the land with restrained grandeur, its windows thrown open to spring light, its gardens orderly yet alive with birdsong. Within, the Duke of Ashcombe moved like a man already weary of possession. At 25, he bore beauty that had never softened into vanity, and a reserve forged early by duty. The title had arrived with his father's death, and with it a sharpened understanding that marriage, in his world, was seldom affection and always strategy. Their first meeting was brief, formal, and decisive. He listened without interruption as her situation was explained, his gaze steady, appraising, remote. When he spoke, his voice held no warmth and no insult, only clarity. She would cook the evening meal. She would remain 1 week. The arrangement would end without extension. Then, as if anticipating the unspoken calculations of society, he added quietly that she was not to mistake proximity for possibility. "Just cook for 1 week," he said, "and do not attempt to be my wife." The words struck with humiliating precision, yet Guinevere neither flushed nor faltered. She recognized the warning not as cruelty, but as armor. He had been pursued before, measured, weighed, and found desirable for reasons that chilled him. She answered with calm assent, her voice steady, her eyes lowered in respect rather than submission. In that moment, the Duke observed something unexpected, a woman neither pleading nor plotting, but standing upon the last intact fragment of her dignity. As the door closed behind her, Ashcombe settled into an uneasy quiet. The Duke returned to his papers, yet found his attention unsettled, aware that within his kitchens stood a present society would misinterpret, and he himself did not yet understand. Guinevere, meanwhile, laid out borrowed utensils and prepared to serve a household that had already judged her. Between them stretched a week bound by necessity, restraint, and an unspoken tension that promised neither comfort nor safety, only change. Outside, the afternoon light lingered upon stone and leaf, indifferent to human calculation, while servants observed in cautious silence. To them she was an uncertainty, a gentlewoman handling knives, a presence that unsettled established order. To him, she was an inconvenience he could not yet dismiss from thought, a reminder that authority did not insulate one from unease. Though neither spoke again that day, awareness moved through the house like a held breath. The week had begun with terms clearly drawn, yet already those lines felt less certain. Guinevere understood that survival required restraint sharper than pride, and she resolved to give nothing that could be mistaken for desire. The Duke, alone in his library as evening approached, told himself that 1 week was insignificant, that he had endured far greater trials without disturbance. Still, when the bell rang for dinner, he paused before answering it, unsettled by the knowledge that the meal awaiting him would be prepared not by habit, but by intention, and that intention, quietly and without permission, had entered Ashcombe with her. In that pause, the future stirred, unannounced, fragile as spring itself, and neither could yet see how irrevocably the coming days would alter the course of both lives forever beyond expectation. The first evening meal at Ashcombe passed in near silence, broken only by the measured sounds of cutlery and the distant call of birds beyond the open windows. Gwenera had prepared a simple broth, clear and fragrant with herbs gathered from the kitchen garden, and bread baked that morning with careful hands. There was no flourish, no attempt at display, only nourishment offered without commentary. The Duke noticed this restraint at once, and though he did not praise it, he ate more slowly than usual, as if listening to something long forgotten. Each day unfolded with similar quiet. Gwenera rose early, learning the rhythms of a household that was not hers, moving through it with courtesy rather than familiarity. She spoke little, answered precisely, and avoided all unnecessary presence. Yet her influence announced itself in small, undeniable ways. A chair drawn closer to the fire before evening fell, a meal served warm despite delays, a steadiness that calmed the servants who watched her with curiosity edged by suspicion. She accepted neither their pity nor their probing, guarding herself with the same discipline that kept her upright when loneliness pressed hardest. The Duke observed her from a distance he pretended was indifference. He found himself lingering at the table after meals, reluctant to return to rooms that echoed with authority but no welcome. Memories stirred unbidden, recalling a childhood table where kindness had once existed before it was taught out of him. He told himself it was the novelty of change, nothing more, yet the awareness persisted, quiet and persistent as breath. On the third day, relatives arrived without notice, bringing with them the sharp scrutiny of rank and expectation. Their conversation filled the drawing room with polished laughter and subtle appraisal. Gwenera, entering to lay a tray, felt the shift immediately, the way eyes measured her usefulness and speculated upon her ambition. She moved with practiced composure, refusing to shrink, refusing to perform gratitude. When one voice remarked, lightly but loudly enough, that temporary arrangements often inspired permanent hopes, the Duke did not look up, and the silence that followed was heavier than rebuke. Later, as afternoon waned, Gwenera sought the garden for a moment's air. Spring had claimed the grounds fully now, blossoms trembling in mild wind, green pressing against every stone. There, beneath the indifferent beauty of the season, the weight of the remark found its mark. She did not sob, for sobbing felt like surrender, but tears escaped despite her will, blurring the ordered world before her. Shame was a familiar companion, yet had never before carried such sharp injustice. The Duke encountered her by chance, or so he told himself. He saw at once what pride had failed to conceal, and the sight struck him with unexpected force. This was not calculation, not artifice, but pain born of being seen and misjudged. For the first time, he understood the cost of the warning he had issued so coldly. He spoke her name quietly, not as an order, but as an acknowledgment. She steadied herself and turned, offering him honesty instead of defense. In that moment, amid spring light and unguarded truth, the distance between them narrowed, and though neither named it, something irrevocable had begun. They did not speak again that day, yet the house itself seemed altered by the encounter. Servants moved more softly, as though aware that something fragile had entered their ordered domain. Gwenera returned to her duties, hands steady, expression composed, though her heart labored beneath restraint. She understood that survival within Ashcombe required a vigilance sharper than fear, and she resolved to give nothing that could be mistaken for design. The Duke, alone in his library, found concentration elusive. Papers blurred beneath his gaze, and the authority he wore so effortlessly felt heavier than before. He told himself that 1 week was insignificant, that he had endured far greater trials without disturbance. Still, when the bell rang for dinner, he paused before answering it, unsettled by the knowledge that the meal awaiting him would be prepared not by habit, but by intention. That intention, quiet and unassuming, had crossed his threshold without permission and now lingered, asking nothing yet altering everything. Outside, evening light settled upon lawn and stone, indifferent to rank or rule, while within, two solitary lives moved toward an uncertainty neither had chosen, yet neither could now ignore. The week remained bound by clear terms, but beneath them, unseen, expectation stirred. It waited, patient as the season itself, promising neither safety nor escape, only change. And in that promise, fragile and unnamed, lay the first true challenge either had faced, for power had never frightened them, but feeling might. The future, still unspoken, pressed closer, and Ashcombe held its breath, unaware that the coming days would demand. Morning after the garden incident dawned with a fragile stillness at Ashcombe, as though the house itself sensed an approaching reckoning and dared not speak aloud. Gwynnera moved through the kitchen with practiced calm, yet every motion carried the echo of yesterday's humiliation and the Duke's quiet witness. She neither sought him nor avoided him, choosing instead the discipline that had preserved her thus far. Dignity, she believed, survived only when guarded fiercely. Yet beneath that resolve lay a trembling uncertainty, for she had been seen in weakness, and once seen, a thing could never be entirely hidden again afterward. The Duke passed the morning in restless confinement, attempting to bury thought beneath correspondence and estate accounts that suddenly felt hollow. Authority had long been his refuge, yet now it offered no shelter from memory or conscience. He recalled the expression upon her face, the restraint more painful than accusation, and recognized something unfamiliar within himself: regret, not for his rules, but for the ease with which he had assumed her resilience. Power, he realized, excused much but explained little. By noon, the silence between them had grown oppressive, demanding acknowledgement rather than avoidance. It would not be denied today. It was he who spoke first that evening, not as master but as man unsettled. He requested her presence in the small sitting room, a space unused and intimate, lit by the softened glow of late sun. Gwynnera entered with composure carefully assembled, every instinct urging retreat. He did not apologize, for apology would have been too small, but he acknowledged the cruelty of assumption. His voice lacked command, and in its absence, honesty found room to breathe between them. She listened without interruption, measuring each syllable, aware that silence itself had become a form of courage for her now. Gwynnera answered with a truth she rarely shared, that poverty was not her deepest wound, but the presumption that it erased her worth. She spoke of service offered without design, of fear sharpened by rumor, and of pride that survived because it must. The Duke listened, struck by the unfamiliar sensation of being trusted rather than petitioned. In her restraint he recognized his own, forged differently, yet born of similar loneliness. The balance between them shifted, subtle but undeniable, as confession replaced contract. He felt the weight of choice settle where duty had long reigned alone within his guarded heart. He offered her something unprecedented: protection without possession, safety without expectation, honesty without demand. She did not accept at once, for trust, once fractured, rebuilt itself slowly. Instead, she asked for clarity, for assurance that her presence would not be mistaken or misrepresented. The request surprised him, and in that surprise lay respect. He agreed, knowing the promise bound him more tightly than command. For the first time, he recognized restraint as strength rather than weakness. Between them formed an understanding neither dared name, delicate as glass, yet capable of cutting through the strictures surrounding their lives with quiet resolve. That night the house seemed to listen as they withdrew to separate rooms, each aware that separation now carried meaning. Gwenera lay wakeful, weighing the risk of hope against the certainty of departure. She knew society would not tolerate ambiguity, and that remaining invited scrutiny sharper than hunger. The Duke, staring into dying embers, confronted the truth that control had insulated him from pain, but also from connection. In choosing clarity, he had invited consequence, and consequence rarely spared the powerful. Sleep came fitfully, burdened by thoughts of promises made and futures narrowed by courage and untested devotion still forming. The following day brought no visitors, yet tension lingered like heat before rain. Gwenera performed her duties with renewed precision, aware that choice had entered her life and altered its shape. She sensed the Duke's gaze not as surveillance, but consideration, a difference subtle yet profound. He spoke to her with measured courtesy, stripping command from his tone. In these small shifts, intimacy grew not through touch, but recognition. Both understood the week's end approached, carrying with it decision or loss. Neither voiced the fear that silence itself might soon become its own irreversible answer to them, both alike equally. By evening, understanding had settled between them, fragile yet luminous, demanding reckoning. Gwenera recognized that leaving would preserve dignity but cost possibility, while staying invited judgment sharper than exile. The Duke, standing at his window, accepted that his authority could not shield her without naming her significance. 1 week had become more than duration. It was now a measure of courage. As dusk deepened, both sensed that whatever followed would dismantle the careful solitude each had built. The moment for retreat was passing. Beyond it waited choice, spoken aloud or denied, but never again avoided by either soul involved thereafter. When the final morning of the week arrived, it did so without ceremony, yet its quiet carried a gravity neither could ignore. Gwenera rose before dawn, aware that endings often announce themselves not with sound, but with resolve. She prepared breakfast as she had every morning, carefully, respectfully, refusing to let sentiment alter discipline. The Duke entered as usual, but the ordinary ritual felt ceremonial now. Each movement weighted with unspoken consequence. Silence stretched between them, no longer empty, but laden with decision. After the meal, Gwenera asked to speak with him, her voice composed despite the cost of steadiness. She informed him that she would depart by afternoon, sparing him speculation and preserving what dignity remained to her. The words were offered without accusation, yet they struck him more sharply than protest. He recognized in her choice the same self-denial he had practiced all his life, mistaking restraint for safety. In that moment, clarity replaced hesitation. If he allowed her to leave unclaimed, he would confirm the very cruelty he despised. He requested her presence in the drawing room, where light filtered through tall windows and softened the severity of stone. There, before the household could witness or interpret, he spoke with deliberate calm. He acknowledged that society would judge regardless of virtue, and that silence would be taken as guilt. He told her that if she left, it would be as a woman unprotected, and that he would bear that knowledge without excuse. Then he did what power had never required of him before. He asked her to stay, not as servant nor guest, but as his intended wife. The proposal held no grand flourish, only conviction sharpened by humility. He spoke of choice rather than rescue, of partnership rather than arrangement. He confessed his fear of being valued only for title, and named the courage it took for him to risk rejection. Gwenera listened, tears gathering not from shame, but from the shock of being chosen openly. She answered with honesty equal to his, declaring that she would not accept marriage born of obligation or pity. He assured her that the risk was his alone, and that love, however late discovered, was no lesser for its restraint. News traveled swiftly, as it always did, and by afternoon the household trembled with rumor. The Duke did not retreat from scrutiny. He announced his intention formally, silencing speculation with authority made gentler by purpose. Gwenera stood beside him, unadorned, refusing embellishment, her presence itself a statement. In that moment, power and dignity aligned, unsettling those who depended upon hierarchy remaining unquestioned. The cost was immediate, whispers sharp, alliances strained, yet neither faltered. Their wedding was held in spring, beneath open skies, witnessed by fields rather than crowds. No excess adorned the ceremony, only vows spoken with clarity earned through trial. Guinevere wore simplicity, the Duke humility, and together they formed a union neither ambition nor fear could have forged. As they stood hand in hand, the past loosened its hold, releasing both from solitude long mistaken for strength. The estate, once emblem of distance, became a home shaped by mutual regard. Yet even as bells faded and guests departed, understanding remained that their choice would be tested by time. Love, they knew, was not victory but commitment renewed daily. Still, as evening settled upon Ashcombe and light lingered upon green fields, they faced the future unafraid. For in choosing each other openly, they had reclaimed something society could not grant nor revoke. The world beyond the gates might whisper, but within them stood certainty, steady and earned. Their story did not end with marriage, but began there, rooted not in defiance alone, but in the quiet courage of two lives reshaped by seeing and being seen at last. The Duke understood that legacy was no longer measured solely in acres or influence, but in the justice of one's choices when witness was unavoidable. Guinevere understood that love demanded bravery equal to loss, and that remaining visible was its truest cost. Together, they moved forward with deliberate patience, aware that respect must be tended like the gardens beyond the windows, requiring constancy rather than spectacle. In the days that followed, routines resumed, altered not in form but in meaning, each shared glance affirming the vow they had made in daylight. Ashcombe, once a monument to inheritance, began its quiet transformation into a place defined by presence. Though the future held trials unspoken, neither doubted the worth of what they had claimed. Spring advanced steadily, indifferent yet affirming, and within that season they learned that love, chosen freely, could endure scrutiny, silence, and time itself, standing firm not because it was proclaimed, but because it was lived patiently together. Thus their beginning settled, unyielding, hopeful, and irrevocably bound by shared resolve.